So far in the plenary sessions, we've explored themes of people and the planet, and we started getting into the power of place in yesterday's lunch session. But now we're going to take a deep dive into the power of community, and especially community at the local level. And who better to talk to us about that than someone who is the CEO of a group called Locality. Locality is a national network in England that supports community organizations to improve people's lives through community enterprise, community asset ownership, and social action, campaigning for a local by default approach to public services, and looking to create not just strong, resilient communities, but powerful communities. And that's something that really was something that I was taken with a couple of years ago, was that idea of the language of powerful and ambitious communities, and not just strong, resilient communities. So this is something that I've been very excited about for a while, as I mentioned. So joining us this morning is Tony Armstrong, who joined Locality in 2014. But before that, he was Chief Executive of Living Streets, the national charity for pedestrians in the UK, and was also a civil servant for 9 years, holding a number of senior policy advisor roles in government. He worked on neighbourhood regeneration and renewal, health improvement, and one of the original staff members of the government's Neighbourhood Renewal Unit from 2001. He was responsible for local work on neighbourhood management and health inequalities and the development of local strategic partnerships. We're very grateful Tony has come all the way from the UK to be with us. Please welcome Tony Armstrong.
Hi everybody, delighted to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me and for that great introduction. Although I was slightly concerned that you've been following me for 2 years. It's a bit like a stalker, and you know you've made it when you've got a stalker. So I'm going to talk, I've got this session, and I've been asked to talk to you, to give you some inspiration, to wake you up from maybe a blurry-eyed night before, and to give you some practical tips. So that's a lot to fit in to the next session, but I'll do my best. What I'm going to try and do is give you some kind of principles about what we think makes up this concept of powerful communities. I'll give you a few ideas and case studies and practical suggestions, but also talk about the kind of challenges and the risks. So I've kind of got a few things to do. But first of all, I thought, as I've got a captive audience, I'd give you a bit of a slideshow. This is kind of where I come from. This is Grimsby in England, not Grimsby, Ontario, which is named after Grimsby in Lincolnshire. Has anybody been to Grimsby in the UK? Yes? Wow. Even most people in the UK have never been to Grimsby. It's very much the place that's not on the way to anywhere. But it was famous as a fishing port. It kind of suffered like a lot of northern industrial towns with the post-industrial decline, and also it declined when the fishing industry declined, particularly in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So quite a poor place. Where you see that stand, it says "Welcome to Nunsthorpe," and Nunsthorpe is what we call a council estate, a kind of purpose-built housing estate for social housing, post-war council estate, very run down, and it's got a bit of a reputation. And this is my family. This is me at the very front. We're all wearing very fetching matching sandals. This is about 1979. And I come from a family of very strong women in that estate, kind of very, very clear principles and everything. The one on the second from left is not actually Brian May from the band Queen. It is, that's my Auntie Joan, and she's still got hair like that. And this is where I come from. There's a great deal of pride in this kind of area, but also quite a lot of social problems. In particular, in the past, it's a huge drug problems, huge crime problems, lots of kind of built environment, environmental degradation kind of issues as well. And this is an alternative image of Nunsthorpe. Has anybody seen these pictures before? No. Well, these are actually not factual pictures. These are fictionalized from the film Grimsby, the Sacha Baron Cohen film, if anybody has heard of that. called Grimsby. They tried to film it in Grimsby. It was very much a kind of what we would call a poverty porn kind of thing. It was laughing at kind of poor people set in Grimsby, and actually they were the subject of protests in Grimsby, so they had to film it in Essex. So what you see here is people in Essex pretending to be people from Grimsby. But this kind of just shows, I think, the attitude we have, certainly in the UK, maybe here as well, around poor communities. They're a subject of laughter, derision, and people look down on them. Lots of people, because of our kind of polarised way of building housing and different tenures, actually lots of people don't understand how people live in different kinds of circumstances and different kind of places. And then I now live in the east of London. I've lived in London for longer than I ever lived in Grimsby, actually, but I live in Hackney, which is the kind of really trendy bit of London for those who don't know it. It's a very multicultural area, very, very kind of inner city, urban. It has all of the kind of problems and the benefits that that kind of area brings. But one of the things that's really happened to the area over the last 10 to 20 years is this concept of gentrification. It's become now one of the most expensive places to live in London. It has kind of been seen huge inequalities growing. Lots of people are being forced out of the local area and forced to live miles away from London. And spend a lot of travel coming back to work in Hackney. But it's also, the benefits of that means that there's a more vibrant community, crime has come down, it's a better place to live, more investment has come in. So the kind of the double-edged sword of gentrification and change in the local area. So that's kind of my story and about kind of how I view the sense of communities, really. I just thought that might be useful context for some of the things I now kind of talk about. So my organisation, Locality, we cover England. We don't cover Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but we have sister organisations and we network very closely with those other organisations. And we have adopted this concept of the power of community. It's our strapline, it runs through everything we do, and I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by the power of community in different respects as we go along. But that's our kind of core belief. We believe in this concept of the powerful community, that all communities have power in them, latent power, and it needs to be unlocked. We don't talk about community empowerment. If only we could empower communities, because we can't empower communities. Communities empower themselves. And our kind of philosophy and our belief on this and our kind of theory of change is that we see the role of local community organisations being absolutely critical in helping communities be confident, sustainable, and supporting local people. So we as a national organisation, we're a membership network, we have over 600 members, but our role is to help those community organisations do their stuff, be as strong and successful as they can be, because we believe that strong community organisations lead to powerful communities. So that's really the kind of, simply, I can finish this now, that's our kind of headline set of beliefs. So we were founded, our roots go back to 98 years ago when we were founded as the national membership body for the university settlement movement. So the university settlement movement was one of those really important social movements of the last 200 years. Set up, this is Toynbee Hall, which is in the east of London. It was the first settlement house that was set up, and very quickly followed by hundreds and hundreds of other settlement houses and neighbourhood houses. The original concept was that academic institutions set up a physical building, built a building or acquired a building, and then academics and students would live among the poor doing good works. It was very Victorian at first, but very quickly turned into quite radical social experiments about empowering local people. So this concept still, it was, first of all, it was about making sure the poor were hygienic and understood good manners and things like that. Then it was about empowering them, and then it actually became about how do we create this sense of powerful communities. They didn't use that kind of language, but the roots go back there. So the settlement movement was really important in creating the first elements of a welfare state in the UK, spread very quickly to North America. There are many settlements in Canada and in the US as well. And our roots go back to that, but also we have lots of other traditions across our membership, including economic-focused organisations, development trusts, and social action-focused organisations that sprung up around tackling inequalities, particularly around ethnic minority inequalities in inner-city areas. And the power of our network, without going into all of this, just to give you a flavour, we have over 600 of these community organisations in our membership across the country. They are powerful in themselves because they employ thousands of people. They reach thousands of people every week. 400,000 individuals use the services of our member organisations every week, which shows the breadth of contact they have with people and also the demand for their services. But also economically, they own almost £800 million worth of physical assets, buildings, land and other assets, which gives them an important economic stake in what happens in their local neighbourhood. And we call this model the Community Anchor organisation. You probably can't see the writing on there, but basically some of the principles that we hold dear around this are that our members are place-based organisations. That's our kind of number one principle at Locality. The organisation is rooted in that place. It will champion the place and all of the communities that live within that place. They will be entrepreneurial. They often use enterprise. They use the management and ownership of physical assets to generate income so that they can also deliver services, which is really important onto the next principle, which is that of independence. So our organisations are not part of the public sector, they're not part of the private sector and profit sector, they are non-profit independent organisations that work interdependently with the public sector and the private sector. And what we do, you may not be able to see that as well, we do basically 4 things at Locality to help our members be strong and successful. So we provide direct services to them, we help them with things like business planning, income generation, tricky things like tax rebates and governance support, very practical things like that. We also provide a space for them to network with each other. Peer-to-peer networking is a really important principle because it's often when you learn from your peers that you learn more sustainably and quicker. And we facilitate a number of programs to enable our members to go visit each other and go on shadowing programs, other things like that. We use our influence. The third thing we do is we are active in the policy and influencing space. We lobby and campaign for change. We work closely with local government and national government. And then the fourth thing we do is that we try and also encourage individuals to be more active in their local community and to develop groups and to play more of a role in taking back control. So that was a quick run through of us. So I always do this, and it's always good to put a picture of Donald Trump on the thing. I was kind of doing this slide and starting to think about the context we're operating in. Well, starting with the big context, a picture speaks 1,000 words. I don't really need to talk about some of the challenges that we are all facing across the Western developed world in particular, the rise of populism, polarization of political debates, the kind of anti-science, anti-rational argument, anti-expert kind of view. All of these things are kind of colliding at the moment. We're all seeing them in all of our countries, manifesting in slightly different ways. Lots of Europe has now right-wing governments part of government. Right-wing parties part of government or very close to taking over government. Populism has certainly reared its head in the UK through Brexit, which I'll talk about in a minute. You wouldn't get a presentation from a British person without us going on about Brexit. And obviously in North America and Canada and in the US, of course, we're seeing some of these problems. Part of this is kind of this response and backlash around globalization. And for us, we are starting to talk more about localization as an antidote to globalization and this kind of feeling of control. For us, this kind of concept of communities being in control is something we've always pushed, but that seems to be raised up the political and priority list, and that many communities are feeling as if they're completely helpless, they have no say over things, and they're looking for any kind of answer and any kind of solutions that are peddled to them that will make a difference. In the UK, we've faced kind of 10 years now of quite harsh austerity. David Cameron was the Prime Minister then. That's the picture of him, if you can't recognise him, looking cheerful. He's completely buggered up the country and then buggered off, which he's possibly one of the most disliked politicians we've ever had. But in 2010, the Conservative-led coalition government set a big ambition to reduce public spending by over 10% over 5 years or so. And actually the hardest cuts fell on local authorities or local government. So to date in this financial year, councils have been cut by 49.1% so far, which is obviously quite a large cut. Some of that has been made up through local taxation increases, but actually the central government grants that were given have been cut by almost half. So local authorities have been therefore having to cut all of their services. So there are now almost no youth services funded by any local government. They're all funded by voluntary sector organisations, if indeed there are any youth provisions. And most local authorities are now sounding the alarm about the statutory responsibilities that they have to keep funding, are mainly focused around older people's social care and younger people's social care for children in particular at risk. And the budget position is that basically they are the only things that they will be able to fund in the future. So we're now starting to see a wave of local authorities giving bankruptcy warning in effect. Not quite as simple because they don't have the same process, but the first local authority this year went bust effectively, and many more are saying that they're going to have to cut most of their services to the bone. So that's the environment, and that's had an impact on our members because a lot of our members have had funding in some kind of way from their local authority, and also the demand that they face has increased. So they've had a double whammy hit because of this austerity, which continues. The cuts actually haven't stopped yet. The cuts are going to be continuing over the next 3 years to local authorities. And then, of course, Brexit. So this is Boris Johnson, if you don't recognise him. And this bus has become notorious because the claim that we would magically get lots of money back from leaving the EU, this 350 million a week that we would get back as a magic Brexit dividend. We're now, according to kind of respected financial think tanks, already suffering to the tune of about £450 million a week from lost economic growth from the decision, which is set to increase. I am a fervent Remainer, just so you know where I stand on this. But actually, regardless of what anybody thinks about the referendum, there are some key problems that we're facing across our membership. So the main thing that we have noticed over the last 2 years is that government is not interested or capable of thinking about anything other than Brexit. And so no long-term decisions are being made because civil servants are scrabbling around trying to find out, trying to wait to see what happens in terms of big trade policy before being able to think about how much else we can do on policy, which means there's basically a kind of freezing in any public policy debate on anything other than Brexit-related stuff. The divisions that were unleashed, certainly we already knew that there were lots of inequalities, and in a way, the referendum has helped attention be focused on the plight of areas that no one has ever thought about for kind of 40 or 50 years. But actually, the toxic kind of debate is something that doesn't look like it's going to go away. People aren't trusted to have a rational debate about anything anymore. And our members are really concerned about three things when we ask them about this. They're really concerned about community cohesion. This was particularly the case immediately after the referendum when people started hearing and reporting racist attacks in areas where that had never been an issue before. People from Eastern Europe were being told to fuck off home the day after the referendum. And it was a really big issue. It remains a really big problem. Economic inclusion, a really big problem. If we were thinking about this being a kind of big shock to our system as a way of thinking something positive and a new way of thinking about an inclusive economy, that was our hope, kind of maybe 18 months ago, maybe something good will come out of this, but it certainly isn't happening. We're now talking mainly about deregulating everything to kind of undercut the rest of the European Union economies. And then stronger local decision making. In actual fact, this feeling of people feeling a lack of control, take back control, was the slogan of the Leave campaign, which is incredibly effective because people could pin whatever they wanted onto that slogan. But it was actually, when you talk to people in kind of underdeveloped communities that have really suffered from post-industrial decline, like my hometown of Grimsby, people say, they have no control, all the jobs are going, and they're actually not decisions that are being made by government or by the European Union, they're decisions that are being made by global companies and economic forces. And then there are still a lot of practical problems that are unresolved. So At the moment, there is about £6 billion of regeneration funding, in effect, that comes back from the EU to fund kind of regional projects, and that's going to stop in March, and there's no replacement as yet been announced. We take part in lots of exchange programs with European partners for young people and professionals to get together, and we're now frozen out of those programs. The economic support that exists, particularly in rural areas, there's a huge array of different grant programs and support programs for rural areas. Again, no decision has been made on that. And then also, which might be an opportunity, there is no clarity on what procurement rules that we are going to have once we come out of the EU, because it's not clear yet whether we're going to be part of the single market, etc., etc. So that's Brexit. I won't talk about it anymore. But that's having a big impact. And then the other kind of key trend is that people themselves have been talking about their kind of fears for the future. So there's been an inquiry going on for the last kind of 18 months or so ago, funded independently by charities and membership organisations ourselves, to say what actually will communities look like, what will civil society look like, to try and kind of wrest some of the impetus away from government and the public sector. So these are the kind of things that people in local communities are saying about the role of civil society and the role in the future. But there's a huge amount of pessimism, basically, in the UK at the moment, not a lot of hope. And people who are being pessimistic are basically told they just need to be more cheerful and optimistic, and then we will all be fine. Which isn't really a very sustainable way of doing things. So that's the kind of the bleak bit. So let's see what we can cheer you up by looking at this concept of the power of community. So we talk about this, so what does it mean? Well, I've kind of divided this into kind of four broad areas. We think economic power is really important. This isn't just kind of fluffy stuff. This isn't just about kind of an old style view about community development being nice because all people can take part. And I'm not underplaying the role of community development at all in that. It's about real hard decision-making power for local people. It's about people-powered service delivery and making sure our public services are led and designed by local people. And then it's also about the shift of attitude, which is part of the reason we've adopted this concept so strongly, because we want to really push the fact that if you sit and wait for somebody else to do stuff for you, you're going to be waiting a long time. So, first of all, talking about economic power. The big thing here is about community ownership, and this has been raised quite a lot throughout the last couple of days already. And hopefully there's kind of a fairly general understanding about the benefits of community ownership. But we think this is a really important plank of giving people power, because it creates genuine community control. If a community owns a facility, a building, then obviously it can do what it likes with it within the kind of general parameters of the law. It supports the local economy. Community-owned schemes in the UK in our membership will do everything they can to employ local people, to train local people, to reach out to local people, and to have an open door policy in a way that a private sector company wouldn't, or even a public sector company wouldn't. Public sector agencies quite often now, and I'll talk about this in a bit, basically spend most of their time trying to prevent people from accessing their services through creating thresholds and assessments and putting people on this kind of merry-go-round where they never get what they need. But also, this is about keeping wealth within a local community. So community-owned schemes can generate wealth locally, but also keep it in the local community rather than seeing it leak out. And obviously for our members, it provides them with sustainable income streams. Not always. Not all buildings are an asset, some are a liability, but a lot of our members who own their own assets and own their own buildings are able to develop their own organisation in a more sustainable way. So some examples, we see the kind of traditional community centre. This is New Wortley Community Centre in Leeds being opened with a big ribbon around it. And this is the kind of the archetype, I guess, in our membership. We're a multi-purpose community space which has a kind of balance of renting out to people who can pay for the space and free for local community groups to use. We have an increasing kind of part of our network is communities building houses themselves. So this is Coin Street in the South Bank of London. This is not particularly replicable because they were given basically the south bank of the Thames for £1 in 1983. Lucky them. But they've been able to invest in and capture the land value by building homes for people in housing need in the local area. So now people who would never dream of being able to get a house in the local area have a view to the Houses of Parliament across the river. And their ethos is to focus on the vulnerable people in the local area. So housing is, there's a housing crisis in terms of the supply and the cost of housing in the UK. So more and more of our members are now building houses to be able to manage the affordable rents. We're seeing a huge wave of local pubs being taken into community ownership. This is actually one of my local pubs in Hackney, which is now a community-run pub. It's very good, recommend it if you're ever in Hackney. But we've seen hundreds of pubs now being taken over by the local community, particularly in rural areas where a pub in itself may not make particular economic sense to a large brewery company, but actually it's a vital hub for the local community because there's no other local spaces in the village. So we're seeing a huge wave of pubs being taken over by the local community and turned into lots of additional things, with post offices operating out of the pubs and shops, etc. Swimming pools, we have quite a large network of old Victorian swimming pools where the local authority said, basically this is a money pit, we can't make this work. This example here is Bramley Baths in Leeds. The council was going to shut it. There was a local campaign to keep it open. The business plan was very, very ambitious to create a self-sustaining income stream from it. And the business plan, once it was in community-owned hands, was exceeded within 9 months. So now they're in profit in a way that the local authority was never in profit. And they've widened their services. They're getting awards all over the place. And it's a much-loved local space. Community energy schemes, this is up in the northeast of England, an actual wind turbine. We had quite a positive environment for community schemes to be able to subsidise, to set up community energy schemes, so that then they could both bring in sustainable energy and also bring in income streams. But the government changed all of the tariffs and made it a much more difficult environment. But actually, some of our members have got into the renewable energy game before that happened and are really seeing the benefits of it. And then green spaces and parks, we're seeing quite a lot of local authorities who I mentioned have huge budget problems. They're now basically saying, we're going to close all of our parks and leisure spaces, or we're going to sell them off to private providers. There's quite a lot of our members now who are taking on the management and the ownership of those green spaces and again making a real success of them. This is in Sheffield in the north of England. So across our network we've got hundreds of different examples of community assets, not just the community centres but lots of weird and wonderful and a growing list of different things that communities are now saying, actually if we took these on, if we started running these services, we could do them much better. We could manage them in a way that benefits our local community rather than shareholders somewhere, often in tax havens, and we could also start to use this to generate a more sustainable income stream for us. So just some examples across our network. And we think this is really important because it's about this sense of community control. So we have lots of local authorities who are resistant to transferring what they might call their family silver over to community organisations. How do we know the community organisation will have capability? We want to exert control. So lots of our members will manage public sector owned buildings, which is kind of better than nothing. But what we say is that ownership is the key, because ownership gives you that power and it also allows you to do things financially like borrow against the assets, etc. And then there were two particular mechanisms that I thought I'd mention in this. So one is the two legal powers that we have in legislation that came in the last 15 or so years. The first one is the power of local government to be able to transfer assets to community groups. This is a really important power that was introduced and has been used hundreds of times, and it means that local government can dispose of its assets to local community organisations at less than market value, often for free or for a peppercorn lease or for a rent. And this is the way in which we've seen a huge wave of assets being transferred to community ownership, and this is something that we're very heavily involved in promoting and pushing local authorities to do. It's amazing, though, that lots of local government senior officials will say things like, it's illegal for us to transfer an asset to you, community group. So we have to do a lot of ringing round and telling people off for saying things like that. And then the second power is a more recent power. This was part of our Localism Act, which is kind of one of the things that's kind of famous in certain circles around the world for saying that this is a great thing that government has transferred lots of power to local communities. We say, it hasn't really, but one of the powers that it did introduce was a community right to bid, which is actually quite radical. It means that you can apply to register an asset of community value, for example, a rural pub, which has a really strong community use, and then in the private sector, so this is a privately held building or piece of land, and if it is registered, if the owner of that property wants to sell it, a moratorium is triggered. So they're not allowed to sell it for 6 months and to allow the local community to raise the money to purchase it themselves. So far, 0 properties have been purchased by communities through using the exact letter of this law. However, there have been now thousands, about 900, almost 1,000 assets have been registered as community value, and it's weirdly turned into a badge of honour just to be registered as an asset of community value. So people now proudly display their certificates, and it has kind of changed a culture, but it hasn't actually led to the outcomes in the law. But one of the things that we're particularly concerned about in the UK is the privatisation of lots of our public spaces and places. So we know that there's lack of funding and support for local communities to take on the assets, even if a local authority is keen to transfer an asset. We know that some of the really, really good quality buildings are being lined up to be sold because local authorities are under a huge amount of pressure. I mentioned that councils have a kind of variable approach to how they implement some of the powers that they have, but we're also seeing just this huge fire sale, basically, of any viable property that local authorities have. So we started a campaign a few months ago where we did freedom of information requests to all local councils, asking them how many assets they'd sold each year, and the answer was over 4,000 in 1 year, and actually that had been pretty constant over the previous 5 years. So we're seeing tens of thousands of publicly owned buildings which aren't council's private property, they are all owned by the local community, being sold off to private developers in the main, rather than being thought of about a community ownership. So our campaign is about trying to shift the behaviour in local government to say, actually, you should look at community-owned schemes rather than selling them off. So there's some of the calls. We want kind of new funding. We're asking for £1 billion of support to help this happen and to enable local government to transfer. We want to give stronger powers to local communities. So that 6-month moratorium I talked about, where communities can raise the money, if a landowner at the end of that 6-month period is faced with a community saying, we've raised the money and we'd like to purchase it, they can still say, no, I'd like to sell it to my mate. And we want it to be a right of first refusal for local communities. So we've got quite a lot of activity on to try and generate this concept of community ownership, and it's one of our big priorities because we believe it's one of the really important ways in which communities can kind of gain that power. One final thing on this is Hastings Pier. Has anyone heard of Hastings Pier? It was a bit of a poster child for community-owned schemes. It was also one of the first schemes to raise a significant amount of capital through a community shares issue. So where local community individuals, local community groups could purchase shares, so they would actually get a long-term patient investment on that return in order to fund the activities of the refurbishment and the purchase of this kind of very dilapidated pier. It's stunningly successful for a couple of years. It won the Reba Architectural Prize last year for a great scheme. About 4 months ago, it went bust, unfortunately. And this has just shown the process of the administration where the insolvency people came in. It was actually owned by all those community shareholders, but the insolvency professionals, long story short, basically sold it off to a guy who runs a pier a few towns down for £60,000, even though it had received over £5 million of public funding. So lucky him, but what happens to all the public ownership? So it's not all kind of sweetness and light around this, and one of our big areas of attention at the moment is trying to put in more protections for schemes that are already community owned. So the second bit of the economies, the strong economies, is around strong public services. So a lot of our local members take part in the commissioning and procurement of local services. They deliver services on behalf of the local authority or the local health service, or whoever. They know the place and people. They've often been delivering services to local people for a long time. They're committed. They're not going to suddenly go away because the money runs out. They are there for the local community and they do whatever they can. And they are also responsive and adaptable. So in a way that quite a lot of public services tend to be focused on one-size-fits-all solutions at scale, our members can take a more localised approach. So we've been pushing this concept of our members delivering services at a more local scale. We did some economic analysis because this is the thing that we found to be the most resonant with politicians in particular. If you can't have an economic argument about what about what the benefits of what you're trying to do are, then they're not that interested. So we looked at the return on investment of investing and commissioning our members in terms of the wider economic benefits they bring in their local community. Obviously, they also bring social benefits, but it was really important that we had this strong economic argument too. And the reason we did that is because there's a trend in the UK around the scale and standardisation of public services. So it's now the norm that most local authorities will outsource most of their services. That was kind of okay about 10 years ago because they would have many different types of contracts and grant arrangements with small providers, small businesses, small community organisations because they valued the work they did. Over the last kind of few years, because of these increasing financial pressures, they've now aggregated a lot of those contracts into mega contracts that will be covering a whole range of services, multi-million-pound contracts. And the impact immediately is that lots of our members can no longer bid for any of those contracts because they're not large enough, they don't have the balance sheet, they can't manage the risk, and lots of extra requirements have been placed on providers by local authorities. In the last couple of years, we're now also seeing a trend where lots of those big outsourcing companies who have been the main beneficiaries of this are now collapsing because under the weight of their poor business models. So we're now seeing our members who've had no funding taken away from them, still serving the same community because the big provider wasn't delivering anything that was of use to local people, are now being asked to pick up the pieces of extra contracts. So local authorities are actually not saving money, they're increasing their costs. So what we call scale fail. This picture here is of a campaign in Sheffield, in Yorkshire, where the council got involved in a large contract around street maintenance and street cleansing. And as part of that contract, it says that they will remove trees if that is economically beneficial to the company, because it means if you have no trees, they don't have to have the maintenance of sweeping the streets, maintaining the trees and clearing the leaves. So lo and behold, they've decided to take down all the trees because it's in their economic interest. So the government is tied to this, the local council is tied to this contract, and so we're now seeing daily battles between campaigners and between the contractors just to remove these really mature trees all over Sheffield, which the council says it can't do anything about, which is entirely ridiculous. And then we also talk about this concept of failure demand. So, as I said, lots of public services have been turned into gatekeepers of saying you're not bad enough, you're not ill enough, you're not needy enough to get our service. So professional people trained to help people are now doing assessments. And what we're doing is seeing a cycle of a few people spending a lot of, costing a lot of money for different services and also not getting treated or not getting seen or not getting their services. We've kind of completely moved away from any pretense of focusing on prevention and early intervention, and now we're spending all of the money on crisis interventions. So we talked about the benefits of keeping it local. So this is actually about driving down demand. You know, it's really infuriating when we see that local government is actually under financial pressure, that they are storing up huge extra costs for themselves rather than investing in things which are going to reduce their long-term budgets. But we also know our members deliver better services because they know the names of people who come into their areas. They don't see them as a substance misuse problem or a homelessness problem. They see them as a person with multiple needs, and they ask them about how they can provide support to them in a way that the services, particularly run by outsourced companies, just don't do. And then there's the risks. There are risks involved in this. So, you know, we've got criticised in the past for saying we are basically enabling the state to privatise everything, and community organisations running services is not that much better than private sector organisations running public services. Well, our view is that public services are not being run at the moment. They're at risk of going completely, and we'd much rather have community organisations who are accountable to their local communities running services rather than outsourced. But what we're not saying is that we want the wholesale outsourcing away from the public sector. We still believe the public sector has a responsibility to deliver these things. There's also a lot of suspicion in the UK because when the Conservative coalition came in, they introduced this concept of the big society. And this is the actual logo that they used, which is kind of laughable for a government logo. But they introduced it exactly the same time as the massive austerity cuts. So it was very quickly seen as a fig leaf, basically, for the devolution of cuts, rather than communities being, in a positive way, empowered to do more things. Also, the fact that community-run services does not mean that they are free. It does not mean that we will suddenly have all volunteers delivering a library service, for example, and the local authority can reduce its budget down to zero. You have to invest and you have to work in partnership with community organisations on delivery. And also, the increasing devolution that we've seen can actually entrench inequalities. What the government has done is basically it's said to all local authorities, we will stop funding you through central grants, and you now can raise your own money through property taxes and through business taxes. Well, that's fine for the City of Westminster or for the centre of Manchester, but it's not fine for economically distressed areas that don't have a high tax base. So actually, that devolution and more control over local budgets is at risk of exacerbating those inequalities. And then we've given out some practical help about how politicians can stop this trend. So, what politicians often say to us at a local level, and there might be some in the room that this resonates with, is that they come up to us at the back of meetings and say, sorry, actually, I don't really understand procurement legislation, so I don't feel really in a position to be able to challenge my procurement officers when they say, we have to sign this contract. So we produced a suite of resources, and they're all on our website if you'd like to look at them, to enable politicians to ask the simple questions. So, for example, you may not understand all of the procurement legislation, but ask your local procurement officer how many local providers are in a position to bid for this contract if we put it out in this way. And if the answer is I don't know or none, then you know you're doing something wrong. So there are simple ways in which local authorities can help. So I won't dwell on this, but do look on our website if you want some resources. There are also some examples on our website of where people are doing this right. So Calderdale Council in Yorkshire, they have a Staying Well programme, which is actually about a different way of commissioning. So rather than forcing organisations on the ground to compete with each other, they've talked to the organisations that they know provide a valuable service and asked them to collaborate with each other through a joint commissioning process, which we're involved in fact. And then Plymouth in the southwest of England has got a one system programme where they've completely changed their whole policy around commissioning and procurement, and they're trying to look at it from a whole system approach rather than this approach that just looks at very specialist services on substance misuse and mental health, etc. They're looking at it around a people-based approach. Early days, but I think some really promising things coming out of this. A library is Shropshire Council. I'm running a bit low on time, so I'll just kind of shoot through these. The final thing I wanted just to kind of give you an example of before I wrap up is around local decision making. So this concept of people power. So we think that we need this kind of different approach, and for us the power of community is thinking about not looking from the top, who gives out power, who might allow others to have a little bit of the power. We think the triangle of power needs to be inverted, if you like, and think about the community. The power starts with the local community, and all of our efforts should be about harnessing that power and unlocking it. So we set up, but there's a quote from Winston Churchill. It talks about democracy, the worst form of government apart from all the others. But it's imperfect. So we set up a commission, an independent commission chaired by the former head of the UK Civil Service, Lord Kerslake. It had a bunch of academics, it had some of our members, it had some politicians on it, to look at what we could do to try and improve local decision making. Answer this question really that was exposed by the Brexit referendum about this sense of I don't feel as if I have any control over what happens in my local area. So this ran for just over a year, reported in January this year, and again it's on our website if you want to look at some of the findings. But we talked about this concept of the inverted triangle, because the problem is that we think of central government, we always look kind of upwards to somebody who has more power and ask them to give us some of the power. So it always starts with central government. So we've got a very centralised political system. In England, particularly, we don't have an England administration, it's the UK government. But we need to have powers that actually start with the community. So we talk about flipping this triangle over. And the reason why we focused on this is because these kind of statistics about the feeling of people having no control and a lack of power. So 80%, we did a poll with a professional polling company. 80% said they don't have not much or no control over decisions that affect their country. 71% said that around their local area, and then 70% that Brexit will not make any difference. So people are kind of lashing out and wanting something to happen, but we all know that Brexit is not going to change that. The balance of power the wrong way round, this kind of met, luckily, what we wanted it to say, which was that actually we feel as if central government has quite a lot of the power, but we want local communities, local people to have a massive amount more power than it is. So we need to shift this decision making, where decisions are made, closer to local people. So why localism? Why talk about this commission? Because we saw through the evidence we captured in this commission from local community groups, from local government and from individuals, we know that local people make better decisions about their local area. They know their local place, they can join things up in a way that lots of more remote public sector organisations can't. We can involve people in a way that gives people both agency about what's happening in the local area, builds up local confidence, and makes better decisions for the local people, improving health and well-being as an example. And better belonging, civic engagement, improved community cohesion. If we look at a place-based approach, if people in a local place are more involved in making decisions, then we can use that to join up different communities who perhaps haven't got the connections that they could have. The challenges in this, I think, equality and participation. What came out for us very strongly was that financial inclusion is a major barrier to anything. So if you're expecting people to go along and have a lovely, jolly conversation about what to do with this piece of land for 3 hours on a wet Tuesday, then you're not going to be able to get people who need childcare and everything else. There's an equality also in terms of people's knowledge about things and how to access information and advice, and that needs to be supported. The capacity and resources in local communities have been decimated, as we've seen. There are no community development funds now. Community organisations themselves find it very difficult to be able to justify the capacity to spend on doing that kind of pure community development type of work. And then the connections to other powers. So there's this feeling when we went through the evidence that although you could maybe create a decision locally, there was always this sense that somebody over your shoulder, someone else somewhere, could veto the decision that you were made or change the decision. So thinking about the different ranks of government, somebody always had power that was more powerful than you did. So we came up with some recommendations around this. Obviously, strong community organisations is part of our principle. You need strong community organisations to be able to provide a vehicle for people to have a voice, to provide the space for people to come together. Common ownership and spaces for participation is an obvious one in that regard. and then the political and economic systems to transfer meaningful power. So we talked in the Commission report about a power partnership between local people, local community organisations and local government. So it wasn't just about local government calling the shots in a local area, it was about them having a debate with all of the other civil society players in a place, because the local authority is only one part of the ecosystem. Their view is an important view, but it's not the only view. And then the one example I'd point to in England is that we have powers around neighbourhood planning, which again came as part of the Localism Act about 8 years ago. The neighbourhood planning powers, and we run the support programme to help local communities do this, gives local communities the power to take on the land use planning powers through law to be able to set up a plan for the local area, to allocate space, to create design standards for the local neighbourhood, to think about what use different buildings should be. And it's been an extraordinarily important part of the picture in giving this direct power. So it's one of those examples where legislation can achieve a shift because it has actually transferred critical powers to the local community. Lord Crislake, who chaired the Commission, his quote here, this is the start of a process to try and shift the attitudes and shift the behaviours here. So, coming on to the final bit, seizing the power. This is the final bit for me about what is important in creating powerful communities. It's about changing that attitude. For too long in England and maybe elsewhere, we go to local communities and they say, oh, you know, that piece of green land behind this housing estate has been derelict, kids are on it lighting fires, it's got rubbish all over it, no one ever does anything about it. And you say to them, well, how long has this been going on? Oh, 8 years. And it's kind of, well, what are we going to do about it? Yes, of course it's terrible for the public sector to not do that kind of thing, but what are you going to do about that as a community? So what are you doing to organise and to force the local authority to do something about it, and or what are you doing to try and take ownership and take custodianship of that space in its entirety? So some of the things that come out strongly from our conversations are about don't waiting for permission to do things, don't wait for somebody else to do something when you can do it yourselves. Don't let politicians off the hook, because it's not just about the state withdrawing completely and saying, over to you guys, but just bloody get on with it, is what we would say. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're going to stay there. Can you give me the mic, please?
Sorry.
You know, we have time to take a few questions, a few comments with Tony's presentation. And any question for Tony? Yes, Sarah?
Hey, Tony. So I think most of you were here. I started this conference off with a panel with amazing panelists about inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, which is a big topic in our network right now and with our board and our staff team. And outside of my CCEDNet life, or I guess maybe part of it, I'm really involved in my neighborhood work. In Manitoba, we're organized really similarly. We've got neighborhood renewal corporations that do this kind of place-based work. They're essential to the way things work there. But what we find sometimes is that a place-based approach can kind of be a bit homogenous in terms of who's really in that community. And so if that place-based approach doesn't always consider inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, it can just end up being a reproduction of what's happening in terms of excluding certain identities or demographics at the local level. And so I wonder if you see similar things happening in England. I know my neighborhood is incredibly diverse, and so that's a major thing that we're working on. Maybe that's the same in some parts of England and not others, but do you have any examples or any reflections on how your place-based approaches and your members are trying to tackle that, like making sure that they themselves are truly equitable in terms of who's in their community and who's involved?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and we face it a lot. I mean, I think a place-based approach can be really, really empowering in terms of bringing different communities together and tackling some of the inequalities and cohesion issues, but it can also work against it. So we've had examples where we've had to turn down organisations to join us because they want to have exclusionary access kind of provisions. So they will only reach one particular type of the community, which is absolutely fine, but we are focused on an inclusive kind of open door policy. So we have a charter that people need to sign up to with our principles for having inclusive access. But actually there's lots of really great practice across community organisations who are bringing different people together and tackling inequalities. So we've had in quite a lot of our areas quite significant demographic change over a short period of time. So there's one example, one of our members in Bristol in the west of England, Barton Hill settlements, which went from kind of being traditionally, it's a kind of loaded term, but a white working class area, as everyone used to call it, 15, 20 years ago, and is now about 70% Somali population in the local area. And actually the way in which that community has been the bedrock of managing the tensions and managing the cohesion between the different communities has been really important. And they now have what they would describe as a very cohesive place-based community because they have really strong connections between the different people that live there. But their role was really important in being able to provide the space for those people to come together, to do outreach to different groups and to make them included. So, for example, they have a really clear succession plan over the past kind of 5-7 years where they've been deliberately recruiting more and more people from the Somali community to sit on their board, to become staff members, because they felt as if they, quite rightly, they couldn't represent the community anymore if they were just representing the old community that was there. So lots of examples like that.
Thank you. I think we have another person there. Perfect.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. My name is Nathan Randall from EcoTrust Canada. And I had a question about the transition town movement. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about kind of parallel community-led movements and organizations and kind of what role they play in your eyes with encouraging localization and supporting some of these aspects of the movement. Thanks.
Yep, we've got links to the Transition Towns movement, and there's lots of other movements like that which are kind of people-powered networks. So at a national level, we see our job as to kind of network with other networks to make sure that we're kind of sharing, learning and things. So we've certainly had Transition Town people speaking at our events and conference, and some of them are heavily involved and work with our local member organisations in the southwest of England particularly, where Transition Towns movement is very, very strong. I think for us it's, the challenge is always about trying to straddle lots of different issues at once and lots of networks at once. So, you know, with a kind of network of organisations that run hundreds of different types of services, we're all interested in social justice, environmental justice and everything else. We have to kind of pick the things that we prioritise at any one time. So for us, it's really important to make connections with networks like that. So we will support other people to take a lead often. Similarly with, you know, our partners in the social enterprise network who aren't place-based, we have very strong links with them because we support their aims and we support what they're doing around other kind of forms of public procurement, for example, but we don't take a lead directly.
And just a little addition before the next question. Many CED practitioners involved in the CED movement or the social economy movement are involved also in the transition movement in Canada. For example, I'm part of the transition certified trainer, and I'm not alone in Canada, and we're involved in our community, but also we're involved locally to support initiative and to bring capacity building. So it's intertwined also in Canada, but very much smaller in Canada than elsewhere and UK, for example. Thank you for your question. Anne?
Yes. Hi, Tony. It's Anne Jameson with the Toronto Enterprise Fund. I'm curious about how the community organizations that have acquired local assets have financed that acquisition. You mentioned a few things. You mentioned that local authorities are transferring the assets either for free or for leasing on a lease basis or a rent basis. And you also mentioned the community shares that the Halifax Pier issued. But I'm wondering about all the others and how they finance their acquisition.
Sure, yeah, so the biggest source, actually I should have said this during that slide, so thank you for that prompt, is actually private sales. So that's the biggest source of getting hold of community-owned assets. So community organisations just purchasing from the local authority or private landowners. the way they finance and fund that is often through grant programs. They have dried up quite significantly over the last 5 to 7 years, but there used to be quite significant capital grants programs. There is now an independent funder that was set up by our National Lottery Fund called Power to Change, and they are set up to deliberately support community enterprise activities. So for us, they're a fantastically strong strategic partner because they fund a lot of our member organisations. So that's been a really important way of securing both developmental revenue funding, because it takes a lot of time, which is fairly at risk when you're deciding whether a building is feasible or not, to the capital grants. Then financing, debt finance is a major part of the mix. I think in the UK we've got a little bit too obsessed with this concept of social investment over the last few years. Social investment is suddenly the answer to everybody's funding needs. Well, it's not, because you can't marketise all of the services and activities that lots of community and voluntary sector organisations do. Plus the social enterprise organisations and finance funds that have been set up are often very expensive. So lots of loans can be had through social investment providers, but they're often at 6%, 7% interest, which makes a massive difference between the viability of a project or not. So it's easier for our members just to go to the local high street bank, who they have a long relationship with, and get a mortgage or get a loan on a property. So debt finance is really important. Where we've particularly focused on community shares is because we see that as a really good way of raising capital. So it's still repayable, but it's equity rather than debt, which is a completely different way of looking at it. And actually in the early years, community shares were raising more money than the big society capital funds through social investment, so they're a really important part of the picture. And for us also, it's an important way of a community organisation giving real stakeholder involvement to your local population, because if people are willing to pay £15, £50, £100 towards your local scheme, then they've got a direct stake in it. They also have a voting stake in it, so it's about democratic ownership. So community shares for us is massively important, and we want there to be 1 million, 2 million individual investors in community shares ideally. It's a kind of like a hidden gem at the moment, and we're kind of heavily promoting it as a concept. So more and more of our members are using community shares issues as a way of attracting finance, and we've seen quite a lot of successful ones over the last year.
And I think the last question from the floor.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your presentation. You mentioned a lot about community ownership and democracy, and the value that you see in that. And the way I've seen community economic development all along is about the control of land, labor, and capital. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to us a little bit about your experience, because when I think about social enterprises today and the wide spectrum of definitions of what is a social enterprise, I'm wondering if you could speak to us a little bit about your experience around potentially the erosion of democracy and the erosion of community control when the shareholders are not just the community, but they're owned by the private sector or hybrid models, for example, and what your experience has been in England on that.
Yep, well, I'm sure we've all been in hours-long conversations about definitions of social enterprises before. And I think the thing for us is, so it's, where do we draw the line about perfection and pragmatism on this? I think a lot of our members who own community assets are not democratic in the sense that they are set up in their governance structures to be membership organisations or to be mutuals or to be co-ops or anything like that. But they are democratic and accountable in the sense that they have trustees which are selected by the local population, and they are regulated in terms of the amount of public benefit they have. So they are non-profit, all the money has to be reinvested. So there are some basic safeguards around money being siphoned off for private gain, which you're not allowed to do as one of our members if you are one of our community organisation members. There is obviously a blurred line, though, in terms of social enterprises who are maybe spin-outs from the public sector. We're seeing a lot of that in the UK, who actually behave as if they're still part of the public sector and often have subsidies which allow them to undercut a lot of community or true social enterprises. And then we're also seeing social enterprise, I think, being used by businesses as a way of gaining kind of market share, because lots of people now are increasingly interested in the concepts of responsible businesses, social enterprises. So we're seeing a lot in the UK of businesses using that kind of language. So everything is blurring quite significantly. I think for us, when it comes down to community-owned projects, we've been saying to the public sector in particular that a way of protecting your stake, because if somebody wants to transfer a public building, an old town hall, a library, whatever, to a local community organisation, the politician's main concern is about capability. And secondly, it's about what happens to this asset if the community organisation gets taken over, collapses, etc. And you can do that by putting in strong requirements into the terms of the transfer lease. So it has to be used for public benefit. If the community organisation is dispersed for whatever reason, then it needs to be transferred to another similar community organisation that the local authority can control, or it reverts back to the local authority to do with it what it wants. So you can put in lots of these protections. What we saw with Hastings PM, which is the big kind of thing we're all very concerned about at the moment, is that it was just moved from the public sector into community hands and then just given to a private entrepreneur with no scrutiny whatsoever. So the protection, what happened there was that the council didn't exert its responsibilities early enough at the very beginning, and all of the funders, the independent funders, could have played a really important role in ensuring that that was kept in community ownership, but they didn't. So I think there's quite a lot of failures in that process which we're trying to explore at the moment. But you do need to have that protection, that security, and you can do that through legal means when you're doing the transfer.
Tony, you shared with us wisdom about the power of community, believing the community, the power of the community, but also trusting the power of the community. Your presentation made so much sense with the theme of our conference, an economy that works for our all, and empowering the community, increasing the community ownership, but also creating wealth by and for the community, and engage with the strategic alliance with the municipalities and many other stakeholders in our community. Your presentation has been very thoughtful, and more than that, and it's been quite a while I heard that, but I think you heard it too. Just bloody how did you say that? Just bloody get on with it. It's so much fun to hear it again. But thank you so much, and on behalf of everyone in the room, a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.